Chapter 21. Elizabeth. Elizabeth yawned as the light filtered in through the small bedroom window the next morning. She wasn't normally so tired in the morning, but she hadn't slept well the night before at all. The events of the day before kept replaying in her head, and she'd tossed and turned, trying to figure out if she could have done anything differently. She'd come up empty, and so the prospect of another day in town didn't hold the same excitement she'd felt yesterday. But she wouldn't give up. Not only because she'd told Carl she wouldn't, but also because it wasn't in her nature. Yawning once more, she stretched and breathed deeply, hoping the extra oxygen would wake her up. Then she pushed back the covers, placed her feet on the floor, and forced herself to begin her day. She pulled out her blue gingham dress and put it on. It wasn't her favorite, but with one dress in the store window, one unfinished in her shop, and the others needing to be washed, it would have to do. She'd been so busy lately that she'd been neglecting the washing, but she would make sure she had time to do it this afternoon. Carl was at his usual place at the table when she entered the kitchen, and she answered his good morning with a nod while she began heating the oats for breakfast. When she set the bowl down in front of him, he grasped her hand.
I know you're struggling with all of this, Elizabeth, but God is bigger than this issue, bigger than the people in this town, and even bigger than you and me. If we trust in Him, He will guide us through this.
Elizabeth looked down at his hand holding hers, and her skin tingled from his touch. She hadn't realized how much she missed that simple human connection, and then his words registered with her, and she realized that she hadn't been talking to God. She hadn't brought this issue before Him at all, nor had she prayed for wisdom on how to deal with the situation. Carl was right. She did need to turn her focus back to God. "I haven't been doing a very good job of that these last few days," she said, as she squeezed his hand and took her place across from him. "But I think you're right, and I'm going to try and do better." Carl smiled.
We all stumble from time to time, but I'm delighted to hear you say that. Let's start now.
Elizabeth closed her eyes and let him pray for her, and she had to admit that she did feel a little more at peace when he finished. They finished breakfast, and then Elizabeth helped Carl saddle up Brownie. She figured she would need to learn to do it herself one day. "Thank you," she said as they finished.
"For what?"
he asked. She stepped closer to him. "For being patient with me, for letting me follow my dreams, and for not pushing things between us to move faster. I know this probably isn't what you were hoping for, but I am trying." He took hold of her hands again.
"I would be lying if I said I wasn't looking forward to the day we have with Kate and Jessie, or William and Emma do, but I've asked God for patience, and I do believe He will get us both through this."
"I hope you're right. It feels awful being accused of something I didn't do and not having people trust my word. I'm sorry that I didn't believe you at first about Emma." She pulled her hand from his to place it on his cheek. "You're a good man, Carl Baxter." Carl placed his hand upon hers and pulled it to his chest.
"And you're a good woman, Mrs. Baxter. I understand why you had a hard time trusting my words, since I wasn't the one to tell you first. I hope today goes much better for you." She smiled up at him. "I think it will." Then she lifted on her toes and brushed her lips quickly against his. It was a small gesture, but one she hoped he would understand was her peace offering, and baby step towards more. Before the kiss could deepen, she pulled back and swung up onto the horse. "I'll be back later." Carl waved as she urged the horse forward, and she was on her way. Though less jubilant today, Elizabeth had hoped that things would improve for her in town. As she entered the thickest part of the brush before town, though, a chill ran through her body once again. Just like yesterday and the day before, she felt like eyes were watching her. She glanced around, but there was nothing there, or at least nothing she could see. But someone had to be watching her. She just wished she knew who and why. She pulled the horse to a stop in front of the general store and blinked.
her dress was gone from the window. Had someone stolen it as well? She would hate for that to be the case, but if they'd stolen from her, perhaps that would help convince the deputy and the other members of the town that she was innocent. With her heart pounding in her chest, she tied the horse to the rail and then pulled open the door to the general store. Mr. Brown looked up as she entered, and though he said nothing, she could read volumes on his face. No, not again. What happened now?
Someone cut some fence on the Johnsons' farm. A bunch of their cattle escaped. I'm sorry, but I had to take your dress out of the window, and I have to shut you down for now, until this is all figured out.
Elizabeth's eyes burned as anger and hurt welled up inside her. But you know I didn't do this, don't you, Mr. Brown? Her voice trembled, and she hated herself for showing emotion. Mr. Brown sighed and shuffled around the counter toward her.
I do believe you, but I have a business to run as well. With it being the Johnson farm and your issue with Rebecca, I'm afraid I may be one of the only ones who does.
His eyes were soft with sympathy, but his words were a knife to her heart.
Hopefully it's only for a few days while they find the culprit.
They won't, though, Elizabeth said, shaking her head. They've already decided it's me, and they probably won't look anywhere else. She couldn't believe this was happening again. How would she ever prove her innocence? If it was Rebecca trying to frame her, had she really cut her own fence just to cast the blame on Elizabeth? That seemed unlikely, as lost cattle would cost her family money. But if it wasn't Rebecca, then who would do such a thing? And then a cold feeling settled in the pit of her stomach.
What is it, Mrs. Baxter?
Elizabeth shook her head. She wouldn't say anything until she was sure. Nothing. Is my dress okay? A look of sympathy covered his face.
It's upstairs with your other things. I didn't want anything to happen to it. Now, I'm not trying to run you out, Mrs. Baxter, but the menfolk were helping Mr. Johnson round up the cattle. They'll be coming back soon, and
I should be gone when they do, she finished for him.
I'm so sorry, but they'll be wanting a word with you when they return.
Elizabeth nodded, tears pricking her eyes. She would not cry, though. There was too much to do. If this was Jacob's doing, she needed to find him and stop him before he did something worse. Untying her horse, she quickly swung up and headed toward the outskirts of town. If she'd felt eyes on her as she passed through the brush, maybe it was finally time to investigate it a little closer. The noise of the town, though it had been quieter today, faded behind her, and the sound of chirping birds and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze took its place. How peaceful this place would feel if she wasn't so... Elizabeth was flying through the air before she even had time to register what had happened. Her right shoulder hit the ground first, followed by her hip and then her head. Pain shot through every nerve in her body, and she faintly heard the horse whinny and then take off running. No. She was fairly certain that she uttered the word and that her hand reached out, but her head was so heavy and the light hurt her eyes. Then she felt hands on her, lifting her up. Someone had found her. They had seen her fall from the horse and were going to take her to Doc Moore, to Emma. But no, she wasn't being carried with care. She was slung over someone's shoulder.
Careful with her. I want her alive.
Elizabeth's heart nearly stopped. She knew that voice. Jacob. Panic flooded her senses, and she forced herself to fight through the pain. She pounded on the man's back and flailed her legs, hoping to land a solid enough kick that the man would let her down. But his grip was like iron, and her strength was no match for his. She opened her mouth to scream, but before she could, her head was yanked backward, and a calloused hand covered her mouth.
Best come along quietly,
Jacob said, his breath hot on her neck.
Unless you'd like me to rough you up a bit first.
Elizabeth whimpered against his hand, her pulse pounding in her throat. She had known Jacob was dangerous, but never had she imagined he would go this far. How had he even found her? And who was the man carrying her?
"Now I'm going to remove my hand from your mouth, but if you scream, I'll make certain it's the last thing you do."
She was tempted to test him on that, but her head still pounded, and the man holding her was too strong for her in her injured condition. It would be better to wait and see if an opportunity for escape arose when he put her down. So she kept her mouth closed. Jacob flashed a triumphant smile at her and then hollered for the man to keep going. The man began moving again, but Elizabeth had no idea where he was taking her. She tried to gauge how long they walked, but the bouncing with every step set off the pain in her head, and she was fairly certain she blacked out a time or two. Suddenly, the man stopped moving. She raised her head to look around, but before she could, he unceremoniously dropped her onto the ground, the jolt reverberating through her body and causing her teeth to snap together. Another burst of pain exploded in her head, but she managed to get a look at the man who'd carried her. Not that it mattered, as she didn't recognize him at all. No doubt Jacob had simply enlisted some unsavory help from a nearby saloon.
"I'll take my money now," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly and just as hard as his face. "Hold your horses. You'll get your money," Jacob said, "but don't forget about the rest of our deal."
The man narrowed his eyes at Jacob.
"As long as you have the money, we'll hold up our end of the bargain."
When Jacob bent down to retrieve the money from his bag, Elizabeth knew this might be her only chance. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, she bolted, racing through the brush as fast as her skirts would allow. Her heart pounded wildly, drowning out the shouts behind her. She didn't dare look back. She just ran. But she wasn't fast enough. A sharp crack split the air. Elizabeth cried out as a bullet whizzed past her cheek, the sting of its passing nearly knocking her off her feet.
"Stop right there,"
Jacob bellowed. Elizabeth risked a glance over her shoulder to find him pointing a gun in her direction. And though she couldn't see his eyes, she had no doubt they would be blazing with the same fury that was evident in his voice. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight of the gun, and she hesitated. She didn't know how good a shot Jacob was, but if his last shot was any indication, she feared he was a good one. Elizabeth froze in her tracks, chest heaving. As much as she longed to flee, to escape this nightmare, she couldn't risk that he would make good on his threat. She wouldn't do that to Carl or to Emma. Defeated, she raised her hands in surrender and turned back to face Jacob. He stalked toward her, shoving the gun into his belt before grabbing her arm in a tight grip.
"You'll pay for that,"
he hissed, his eyes dark with rage. Elizabeth swallowed against the lump in her throat, steeling herself for what was to come. She had lost this battle, but the war was far from over. Jacob would not break her, not if she had anything to say about it.
"Looks like you got a feisty one,"
the other man said, chuckling as they approached. Elizabeth noticed he had a long scar down the side of his face. She wondered briefly how he'd gotten it, and then realized she didn't want to know.
"You just take care of your end, and I'll take care of her,"
Jacob said, squeezing her arms tighter. The other man held his hands up as in surrender and backed away, still chuckling as he did. Jacob dragged Elizabeth into the cave and shoved her roughly inside. She stumbled and fell to her knees on the cold, hard ground. Pain erupted in her knees and palms as the tiny rocks cut into her skin, and when the scent of copper hit her nose, she knew she was bleeding. The cave was pitch black, damp, and musty. In addition to the copper, an odd, unpleasant smell lingered in the air that turned her stomach. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to make out vague shapes in the shadows. Jagged stalactites hanging from the ceiling like sinister teeth, piles of rubble along the walls. An old lantern sat on a crate in the corner, coated in dust and cobwebs. Panic rose in Elizabeth's chest as the reality of her situation sank in. She had no idea where she was, and neither did anyone else. She was trapped, alone at the mercy of a madman with no one around for miles. "How did you find me?" she asked, forcing her voice to sound strong. She turned to face Jacob, who stood silhouetted in the entrance of the cave. "And why? Why couldn't you just let me go?"
"I told you that you were mine, and I don't take kindly to losing things I own."
Jacob's tone was eerily calm, which only served to heighten her fear.
"As for finding you, that was pretty easy once your friend Mary finally started talking."
Elizabeth shook her head. "Mary would never."
"Not without a little persuading, but once she spilled that you were heading west, I figured you must have gone by train, and the good ticket agent was kind enough to tell me which ticket you bought. Following your coach was a little harder, but thankfully you made quite an impression, and my money serves as an efficient motivator. I didn't know how you got the money until I arrived here."
He shook his head.
"You really thought a husband would buy your freedom?"
Rage burned in Elizabeth's stomach, and she curled her hands into fists, wanting nothing more than to pummel Jacob's smug face, but knowing she'd never win. "You better not have laid a hand on Mary." Jacob chuckled darkly.
"As if you care about her. You left her there knowing I would question the girls when you went missing."
"I tried to get her to come with me. She was too brainwashed to leave, too demoralized. She thinks she can't do any better than you. But when I get out of here, I'm going to find Mary and bring her here. At least she'd be free." Elizabeth hadn't thought much about Mary since she'd left, but she did now. And if the woman was still alive, she was going to rescue her and get her things back. Jacob laughed, a deep, throaty laugh that sent shivers down Elizabeth's spine.
"As if you'll be getting away from me again? You've caused me too much trouble already. It's time you learned your lesson."
He took a step toward her, and Elizabeth scrambled back against the cave wall, her heart pounding wildly. "Stay away from me." Jacob let out a low, sinister chuckle.
"There's nowhere to run now. You're mine."
Elizabeth squeezed her eyes shut as panic overwhelmed her, but she had to stay calm, had to think. There had to be a way out of this. She wasn't going to give up hope. Not yet. Jacob hadn't won, not by a long shot. She would find a way to escape or die trying. Then suddenly she heard Carl's words in her head. If she trusted him, God would see her through this. He'd been talking about the situation in town, but why couldn't God see her through this as well? "God, please help me through this. Give me the strength and the wisdom to get out of this." Elizabeth opened her eyes and lunged at Jacob, clawing at his face with her fingernails. He let out a roar of anger and pain, grasping her wrists in an iron grip to restrain her.
"You little witch," he spat,
eyes blazing with fury. Blood dripped down his cheek where she had raked her nails across his skin.
"You'll pay for that."
He slammed her back against the cave wall, the blow forcing the air from her lungs in a pained gasp. Elizabeth struggled against his grip, kicking out at his shins and stomping on his feet, but he was too strong.
"Enough of this nonsense," Jacob growled.
He twisted her arms behind her back and bound her wrists together with a length of rope he produced from his coat pocket. Then he did the same to her ankles. Elizabeth tugged helplessly at the ropes, her shoulders burning from the strain, but it was no use. She had failed. She was going to die here, alone in this dank, dark cave. No one would find her, or even know she was missing until it was too late. Tears stung at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Jacob the satisfaction of seeing her break down. She had to stay strong, keep fighting, and pray for a miracle. As long as she drew breath, she wouldn't give up hope. Jacob strode to the mouth of the cave, blocking out the meager light that filtered in.
"I'll be back for you soon," he said with a sneer. "Try to get comfortable."
And with that, he disappeared, leaving Elizabeth alone in the dark, cold cave. The cold slithered around her like a snake, and the darkness enveloped her, a heavy blanket she could not throw off. Blood and tears mingled on her face as despair threatened to overwhelm her. She didn't know how long she would be trapped here or what horrors Jacob had in store for her. All she knew was that she had to survive. She had to escape, no matter the cost. Her life depended on it.